Hello, this is Ralph K. Ginorio. Welcome to part 8 of my video adaptation of my lessons on the historical background of the 9/11 terror atrocities. Parts 1 through 7 dealt with the events of that day and the history of monotheism through the time of St. Paul and the expansion of Christianity from a Jewish context out into a globally missionizing faith spreading like wildfire through the Roman Empire during the first few centuries of its existence. Now we go back to the Jewish people in Judea. Jesus did not convert the Jews. Most Jewish people simply would not or could not accept the notion of a Messiah that died on a cross. For a people that was so kicked about by history, there was a hunger for an event which is called the Day of the Lord, when God would reach into history, and the tool he would use to pry history open would be his anointed one, the Messiah. The Messiah would come and place the other peoples of the world, place their necks under the Jewish heel. There would be judgment. There would be a reordering of the world according to moral lines, and the Jewish people would be at the top and all others would be below. So what they expected from a Messiah was a man on horseback, a god on horseback, a superhero with fire coming out of his eyes and like a wizard or a dragon. They were expecting something superhuman, supernatural. And Jesus, just a carpenter's son, an illegitimate child from Nazareth, it didn't fit the bill for a variety of reasons. Jesus was executed in the year 33, AD 33. About 35 years later, the Zealots were finally ready to strike. We know of this story from one of their number, a Josephus, who ended up surviving the war. He wrote in his Jewish war how the Zealots were finally ready. They had made all the agreements with all the people they needed to within Israel, and simultaneously throughout the province of Roman Judea and Palestine, all this area, the Zealots rose up. And amazingly, they kicked the legions out. For a brief period of time, the Zealots were triumphant. And the faithful Jewish people were rising up just like with the Maccabees. Now, one of the reasons they could do this is because Rome was distracted by the last days of the effete and weak Emperor Nero and a civil war after Nero's suicide. So, at some point, fairly soon, the Roman armies of Syria and Egypt, the armies of the East, got themselves organized and got their acts together. And under their general Vespasian and his son Titus, the legions marched back in to the Jewish homeland. As the legions marched in, the Zealots stood and died rather than give ground. Josephus himself was in a cave as part of a suicide pact, and the idea was that all of the members of his unit would either die fighting the Romans or would die by taking poison, die together. They would die rather than give the Romans victory. Well, Josephus was a survivor, and when everyone else was dead, he didn't really die. He hadn't taken the poison. He lived to tell the tale. Literally lived to tell the tale. And the tale he tells is of the inexorable march of the legions towards Jerusalem, and the siege of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem held out behind its stone walls for many, many weeks. And during those weeks, they did what besieged populations do. They heaped abuse on the Roman armies, and they stiffened their backbone with their resolve that they would die rather than submit. And when the Roman armies came in, they destroyed Jerusalem outright. Now, there are stories in the New Testament where Jesus describes an apocalypse coming to Jerusalem, where when you see these signs, you flee for the hills, and there will be much misery among women with small children in those days. Well, one of the things he may very well have been talking about when he said that the generation he was talking to would not pass from the earth before these events came to be, would be the destruction of Jerusalem. Under Titus, the future emperor and son of General Vespasian, the Romans systematically burned everything. They destroyed the temple, they destroyed the city, they killed or enslaved everyone. The only pocket of resistance after the destruction of Jerusalem was the old Herodian fortress of Masada, overlooking the Dead Sea. And the Zealots and their families had retreated there. Now, Masada is a hell of a fortress. Not only is it in the middle of a wilderness, which makes the besieging force need to have long supply lines, but Masada is built up on a mesa, what we in the United States would call a mesa or a butte. And you've got the surrounding desert territory. So Masada's walls are built on the top of this butte. I'm tempted to say beautiful, but that would be evil. So you've got this incredible fortress occupied by the Zealots. And the Romans, under General Flavius Silva, besiege Masada. But it's going to take them years to finally get close to conquering the place. The Zealots hold out. The Romans ultimately have to build a ramp in the desert out of local materials, stone. And slowly but surely the ramp gets closer and closer to the walls. Well, it's the night before the final Roman attack. And the leader of the Zealots call his people together. And he says, tomorrow they're coming over the walls. And what they expect is to fight us men, and to take you women and children as slaves, and to parade us before the world in one of their triumphs. If they can capture me alive, they'll parade me through Rome as in chains, as the conquered leader. We could do that. But instead, what we're going to do is we are going to send a message that will echo through the ages. Not one of us, not one man, woman, or child, will allow ourselves to be captured alive. There are certain ways of killing a livestock animal when they're being sacrificed that have them bleed out very quickly. He showed them how to do that to themselves and to each other. People were encouraged to spend a few minutes to say goodbye, and then mothers killed their children, and husbands killed their wives, and the next day, battle-hardened Roman veterans who came over those walls were sickened by the sight of hundreds of dead men, women, and children. All committed suicide rather than give in to the Romans. Now, to this day, officers of the Israeli Defense Force swear their oath of allegiance to the nation at Masada. Masada is considered to be a place of national heroism, a place of glory, because at Masada the Jewish people made it absolutely clear that they would not compromise, that it would be better to die than to surrender. So at Masada they stood and they did something that required incredible will And they gave a lesson that echoes through Middle Eastern history to this day. And like the Maccabees, the lesson of Masada is not simply for the Jews. Our terrorist enemies understand full well the lesson of Masada. Better to die than compromise with the worldly power. Better to kill yourself in the cause of God's work than to live on your knees in subjugation to a satanic force. The dual lessons of the Maccabees, that you rise up and you fight and you don't calculate the risk and you don't count the odds, you just fight and trust to God for everything in a seemingly hopeless cause. And the lesson of Masada, better to die than to compromise. Those echo through the ages, and they stiffen the spines of our terrorist enemies. This is what we're fighting. We are not fighting comfortable, well-heeled people. As the old 1980s Sting song queried, do the Russians love their children too? The only way we'll survive nuclear war is if the Russians love their children too. The Russians were ruled by a totalitarian police state communist government that was at least materialistic. So they had an interest in keeping the world alive because they didn't believe in anything beyond it. But these people believe in a transcendent God having given them a mission to overthrow a satanic worldly power, the decadent us, United States of America, and they have the echoing lessons of Maccabees and of Masada to help them. A generation later, in the 120s A.D., barely 40 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, another Messiah arises. His name is Simon-Bar-Kochba. Simon-Bar-Kochba is everything Jesus wasn't. He's handsome on a horse, he rides well, he's well-spoken, he's a war leader, he's a nobleman, and he says, I am the Messiah, follow me, in a hopeless cause. And once again, the Jewish people rise up and they throw the Romans out, and the legions have to fight their way back to Jerusalem. This is under the Emperor Hadrian, one of the permed emperors. If you look during the Pax Romana at the portrait busts of the Roman emperors, it looks like these guys are from the 70s, from a disco. They've got sort of soft, curly, permed hair. Hadrian is the most civilized of Roman emperors. He's a genteel man whose greatest love was for a Greek boy named Antinous, who named cities after his homosexual lover. Hadrian, the most tolerant of Roman emperors, has had enough with the Jewish people. So around the year 130, when Jerusalem is reconquered, when Judea is finally brought under the heel, he says, I have had enough of you! I am scattering you like sand on a windy day on the beach. You are cast out. Jerusalem is now Aelia Capitolina, the city of my family. Any Jew caught within 50 miles will be hunted down and killed. Your family hunted down and killed. You are exiled. You are dispersed. You are cast out. It is the next diaspora. And for the next 1700 odd years, the Jewish people wander as strangers in a strange land, as a hated minority in other people's countries, while the people left behind rule in Palestine. More on both the Jewish story and on the story of those who are left behind next. Thank you for your attention.